Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're diving into a spine-chilling series that will keep you on the edge of your seat. I'll be narrating 5 truly eerie and unsettling stories, each one revolving around the terrifying experiences of night shift security guards. These accounts are filled with creepy encounters, mysterious shadows, and unexplainable phenomena that will send shivers down your spine. So, dim the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for a night of pure horror as we explore the darkest corners of abandoned places and the nightmares that lurk within. Let's begin. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, my name is Dexter, and I work as a security guard in a small town just outside of Richmond, Virginia. When I took the job at the old abandoned mall on the outskirts of town, I had no idea what I was getting into. It was supposed to be a straightforward gig, keep an eye on the place, make sure no one was breaking in, and report any suspicious activity. Simple, right? Little did I know, I was about to become part of a real-life horror story. The mall had been closed for over a decade. Once a bustling center of commerce and community, it had slowly fallen into decay. Vines crept up the sides of the building, and the glass doors were shrouded in grime. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew was almost overpowering. The once bright storefronts were now darkened and draped in cobwebs. It was the kind of place that made you feel like you were walking through a ghost town. On my first night, everything seemed as expected. The mall was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old building settling. I did my rounds, checking the entrances and making sure everything was locked. It was eerie, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. I was alone in a vast empty building, but I convinced myself that it was just part of the job. But as the days went by, I started noticing strange things. It began with small anomalies, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a soft rustling sound that would stop the moment I turned my head. I chalked it up to the building's age and my own fatigue. After all, working the night shift can play tricks on your mind. Then, on the 4th night, things began to change. I was walking through the dimly lit corridors of the mall when I heard a voice. It was soft and indistinct, like someone speaking just out of reach. I stopped, straining to hear, but the voice was gone before I could make out any words. I dismissed it as the wind or a trick of the acoustics. The following night the voice returned. This time it was clearer, a woman's voice, pleading softly, "Help me." The words were faint, but they were unmistakable. My heart raced as I tried to locate the source. I walked through the food court, past shuttered kiosks and abandoned storefronts, but the voice seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I reached the old service elevator, which had been out of order for years. The doors were slightly ajar, and the voice seemed to come from inside. My flashlight revealed an empty shaft, but the voice continued, "Help me." I hesitated but felt compelled to investigate. I peered into the dark elevator shaft, but I saw nothing. I felt a chill run down my spine and quickly backed away, deciding that I had heard enough. I didn't want to be here any longer than necessary. The next few nights were a mix of dread and disbelief. I continued to hear the voice, and it became a regular part of my shift. The voice seemed to follow me, appearing in different parts of the mall. Sometimes it was a whisper, sometimes a desperate plea. It was as if it was drawing me to certain locations, like a twisted scavenger hunt. One night, I was checking the old electronics store. The screens and monitors were covered in dust, but as I passed by, I noticed a flicker of movement. I turned to see an image on one of the screens, a shadowy figure standing in the food court. The figure was dark and indistinct, but I could see the outline of a woman's shape. My heart pounded as I tried to get a better look, but the image disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. I was starting to lose my grip on reality. The mall was affecting me, and I could feel my nerves fraying. I began to question my own sanity. Maybe the stress of the job was getting to me. Maybe the isolation was making me imagine things. One particularly unsettling night, I decided to confront whatever was haunting the mall. I went back to the service elevator, determined to face my fears. The elevator doors were still slightly ajar, and the voice was louder this time, almost urgent. "Help me, please." I took a deep breath and pushed open the doors. The interior of the elevator was dark, and I could barely make out the outlines of the old machinery. I shone my flashlight into the depths, hoping to see something, anything, that would explain the voice. As my light swept across the elevator, it caught a glimpse of something strange, a shadowy figure standing in the back corner. I couldn't make out any details, but the figure seemed to be reaching out toward me. I felt a surge of panic and stumbled backward, nearly falling to the ground. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It just stood there, its outstretched hand frozen in place. I ran out of the elevator, my heart racing. I had to get out of there. I ran through the empty hallways, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I could still hear the voice, following me as I fled. It was as if the building itself was trying to keep me there, to draw me back to the elevator. I made it to my car and drove home, my mind racing. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the stress of the job was getting to me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I took the next day off, hoping that some rest would clear my head. But when I returned to work, the voice was still there. It was as if the mall was alive with the sound of that desperate plea. I tried to ignore it, to push through the fear, but it was impossible. One night, I decided to take a different approach. I brought a recorder with me, hoping to capture the voice and find some rational explanation. I placed the recorder in the food court, where the voice was strongest, and left it running while I did my rounds. When I played back the recording, I heard more than just the voice. There were faint sounds of footsteps, whispers, and even what sounded like someone crying. I couldn't make sense of it. The sounds were disturbing, but they didn't provide any clues about the source. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare with no way to escape. One particularly eerie night, I decided to investigate the mall's old maintenance area. It was a dimly lit space, filled with rusted tools and broken equipment. The voice seemed to be coming from there, and I hoped I might find some clue to explain what was happening. As I entered the maintenance area, I was hit by a cold draft. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the air felt heavy. I shone my flashlight around, casting long shadows across the walls. The voice was faint, almost as if it were coming from behind a wall. I approached a large storage closet in the corner of the room. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Inside the closet were old maintenance records and equipment, but there was also a large, dusty mirror propped up against the wall. The mirror was covered in grime, but as I wiped away some of the dirt, I saw something reflected in the glass. It was the figure of a woman standing behind me. She was shrouded in darkness, her face obscured, but I could see her hand reaching out toward me. I spun around, but the closet was empty. The mirror showed nothing but my own terrified reflection. I stumbled back, nearly falling over the clutter on the floor. The voice was louder now, almost deafening. It was coming from all around me, filling the air with its desperate plea. I had to get out. I had to leave. I raced out of the maintenance area and down the hallways, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I could still hear the voice echoing in the empty corridors. It followed me all the way to the exit, where I finally burst out into the night air. I drove home in a daze, my mind spinning with the images and sounds I had experienced. I knew I couldn't go back. I couldn't face that place again. I quit the job the next day, leaving the mall and whatever haunted it behind. To this day, I can still hear that voice sometimes. In the quiet moments, when I'm alone, I can hear the faint echo of her plea. I don't know what happened in that mall or why she was there, but I do know one thing: I never want to find out. Sincerely, Dexter. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, my name is Henry, and I work as a security guard in a small town near Charleston, South Carolina. When I was offered the night shift position at the old asylum on the outskirts of town, I jumped at the opportunity. The asylum, a dilapidated relic of a grim past, seemed like a straightforward assignment. Little did I know, I was about to encounter something far beyond the realm of ordinary fear. The asylum, a massive structure of crumbling stone and rotting wood, had been closed for over 20 years. Its imposing facade, covered in grime and ivy, seemed to loom over the surrounding landscape like a forgotten giant. The building was surrounded by a rusting iron fence, and the front doors were chained shut. But the rear service entrance, which was my responsibility to guard, was still accessible. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the silence was almost deafening. My first night was uneventful, or so I thought. The building was cold and dark, with only the faint light of my flashlight piercing the oppressive gloom. I walked through the empty hallways, my footsteps echoing off the walls, and checked every room and door. The atmosphere was unsettling, but I managed to convince myself that it was just the natural unease of working in such a decrepit place. As the weeks went by, however, the unsettling occurrences began. It started with the lights. The old fluorescent tubes in the hallways and rooms would flicker intermittently, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance on their own. At first, I thought it was a problem with the wiring, but the flickering seemed too deliberate. It was as if the lights were communicating or trying to warn me of something. One night, as I made my way through the east wing, I heard a dragging noise coming from the old infirmary. The sound was heavy and rhythmic, like someone was moving a large, cumbersome object across the floor. I approached the infirmary cautiously, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The noise stopped abruptly when I reached the door. I pushed it open and found the room empty, save for the dust-covered remnants of old medical equipment and abandoned beds. Despite the lack of physical evidence, the silence that followed was unnerving. I tried to rationalize it as old pipes or settling infrastructure, but the sense of something being wrong persisted. The noises and shadows began to intensify, and soon, whispers started to follow me through the hallways. The whispers were faint, barely audible, but always present, as if they were coming from the walls themselves. One particularly unsettling night, I was patrolling the basement when I discovered a door I had never noticed before. It was an old, rusted door with a heavy padlock. Driven by curiosity, I pried the padlock off with a crowbar and pushed the door open. The hinges creaked loudly, revealing a small room filled with old medical equipment and dusty files. Inside, I found a stack of patient records. The files were yellowed with age, and as I flipped through them, I came across a file that made my heart race. It detailed the treatment of a patient who had been subjected to extreme isolation and sensory deprivation. The file described the patient's mental deterioration and growing paranoia. The last entry was abruptly cut off, marked only with the word "disappeared" stamped in bold red letters. The sense of dread I felt after reading that file was overwhelming. The whispers seemed to grow louder, and I began to feel a pervasive sense of being watched. One night, I heard a child's laughter echoing through the west wing. The sound was out of place in the desolate building, and it was unsettlingly cheerful. I followed the laughter, flashlight in hand, but when I turned the corner, the hallway was empty. The laughter ceased, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The most terrifying encounter happened while I was alone in the control room. The lights flickered and then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. The only illumination came from the monitors, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I could hear a faint scratching noise, like something trying to get through the walls. I fumbled for my flashlight, and when I turned it on, I saw a figure standing in the doorway. The figure was a woman in a tattered hospital gown. Her face was obscured by shadows, and her eyes glowed with an unnatural light. I tried to move, but my legs felt like they were frozen to the floor. The woman began to advance toward me, her steps slow and deliberate. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I finally managed to flee the control room, not stopping until I was outside. The next day, I reviewed the footage from the security cameras I had set up in the basement. The video showed a shadowy figure moving around the room. The figure appeared to be searching for something, occasionally stopping and staring directly into the camera. The figure's eyes glowed with an eerie light, and the footage ended with a sudden, blinding flash. When the screen cleared, the figure was gone, but the room was in disarray. Files scattered, equipment knocked over, and the locked door slightly ajar. The most chilling experience occurred one night while I was in the control room. The lights flickered again and went out, leaving only the dim glow of the monitors. I heard a faint scratching noise, and the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. The static on the monitors began to swirl, forming a distorted image of a face, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes staring directly at me. The face seemed to move, its mouth opening and closing as if trying to communicate. In a state of panic, I fled the control room and ran through the darkened hallways. The shadows seemed to come alive, reaching out for me. I stumbled through the building, my flashlight casting erratic beams of light that did little to dispel the darkness. The whispers grew louder, filling my ears with a cacophony of unintelligible voices. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath misting in the freezing air. I finally made it outside, my heart racing and my body trembling. I knew I couldn't go back in. The asylum had taken a toll on my sanity, and the experiences I had there were beyond explanation. The whispers and shadows that followed me out of the building never truly left. I quit the job the next day and have not set foot near that place since. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. The asylum's whispers and shadows haunt my dreams, and I often find myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowy figure lurking behind me. Some places are best left undisturbed, their dark secrets buried in the silence of the night. Sincerely, Henry. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, my name is Alan, and I worked as a night shift security guard at a sprawling abandoned warehouse located on the outskirts of a small industrial town in Ohio. What seemed like a routine job quickly spiraled into a series of terrifying and inexplicable experiences that have haunted me ever since. The warehouse was an immense, decaying structure. Its steel walls, once a bright industrial gray, were now a patchwork of rust and grime. The roof, sagging under the weight of years of neglect, looked as though it might collapse at any moment. The surrounding grounds were overrun with overgrown grass and wild vegetation, and an old chain-link fence, rusted and partially collapsed, barely marked the boundary of the property. The warehouse loomed like a forgotten relic of the town's industrial past, shrouded in an atmosphere of desolation. The front entrance was secured with heavy-duty locks, but my responsibilities focused on the loading dock area at the rear of the building. This area remained accessible through a series of creaking side doors and overgrown pathways. On my first night, the warehouse's desolate silence was palpable. The vast interior was shrouded in darkness, and the only illumination came from my flashlight, which struggled to penetrate the thick, swirling dust that filled the air. Every step I took stirred up clouds of debris, and the beam of my light cast eerie, shifting shadows that danced on the walls. The emptiness was overwhelming, and the constant creaking of the structure settling seemed to echo like mournful groans throughout the cavernous space. At first, I attributed the unsettling atmosphere to the warehouse's age and abandonment. However, within the first week, I began to hear peculiar noises. It started with soft rhythmic sounds from the upper levels, distant metallic tapping, or a low hum that seemed to reverberate through the building's empty corridors. I initially dismissed these as remnants of the building's old systems or perhaps the wind, but the noises grew more distinct and deliberate. It was as if something, or someone, was deliberately trying to make its presence known. One night, while conducting my routine check of the loading dock area, I heard what unmistakably sounded like footsteps coming from above. The sound was methodical and persistent, echoing through the vast expanse of the warehouse. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight and ascended the rickety metal stairs leading to the upper floors. Each step creaked under my weight, and the narrow, dimly lit stairwell seemed to stretch endlessly. The upper levels were filled with old storage racks, dusty equipment, and scattered debris. Despite the noise, I found no sign of movement or disturbance, only the eerie silence that returned as soon as I stopped moving. The strange occurrences continued, growing more intense with each passing night. The noises became more pronounced, and I began to hear whispers drifting through the air from unseen sources. The whispers were low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from all directions. They would come and go, leaving me with an unnerving sense of being watched. These whispers were accompanied by sudden, inexplicable cold drafts, despite the warehouse being sealed tight. One particularly unsettling night, I was investigating the office area on the second floor when I stumbled upon a series of strange symbols drawn on the walls. They were crude, hastily sketched in what appeared to be chalk or some sort of white powder. The symbols were a chaotic mix of geometric shapes and jagged lines, their meaning completely obscure. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I examined them, the oppressive atmosphere making it hard to focus. The symbols seemed to pulse with an almost malevolent energy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched closely. As the days went by, the warehouse's atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. Objects began moving on their own in disturbing ways. Heavy boxes would shift slightly as if someone had touched them, and tools would fall from their resting places with no apparent cause. The temperature in certain areas would drop abruptly, creating pockets of cold that seemed out of place amidst the general warmth of the warehouse. The irregularities in temperature and the inexplicable movement of objects were unsettling and added to the growing sense of dread that settled over me like a shroud. One particularly horrifying night, a severe storm rolled in. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making the entire building tremble. The power went out suddenly, plunging the warehouse into near-complete darkness. I was left with only a small flashlight to navigate the pitch-black interior. The storm outside seemed to amplify every sound, and I heard footsteps echoing ominously behind me. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty spaces and shifting shadows. The footsteps grew louder and closer, their source elusive and impossible to pinpoint. I sprinted through the darkened hallways, the storm outside blending with the eerie noises inside to create a cacophony of fear. The cold seemed to seep into my bones, and I felt an overwhelming sense of being pursued by something unseen. My breathing quickened as I tried to find the source of the footsteps, but each turn and corner only revealed more darkness and silence. In the chaos, I managed to locate the emergency generator and restart the power. The warehouse lights flickered back on, revealing the emptiness of the space. Despite the restored illumination, the oppressive feeling of being watched remained. I completed my shift in a state of constant anxiety, glancing over my shoulder and reacting to every minor noise. The storm outside continued to rage, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The most disturbing discovery came the following morning when I reviewed the security footage from the stormy night. The monitors displayed a shadowy figure moving through the warehouse. The figure was indistinct, almost spectral, and appeared to glide through the space with unsettling fluidity. It passed through walls and floors, its movements erratic and unnatural. The figure's shape was difficult to discern, but its presence was unmistakable and terrifying. The footage captured the figure standing directly in front of the security camera, its featureless form staring into the lens with a ghostly, unsettling gaze. The sight was so chilling that I could barely watch it, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I couldn't continue working in that environment. The sense of dread and the haunting experiences had taken a severe toll on me. I quit my job and never returned to the warehouse. The building was abandoned once more, its dark secrets left to fester in the shadows. Even now, the warehouse haunts my thoughts. The whispers and shadows from that place continue to disturb me, and I often wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that something is watching me. Some places are best left undisturbed, and the warehouse was one of those. Its dark history and the inexplicable phenomena that occurred within its walls remain buried in the darkness, and I hope they stay that way. Sincerely, Alan. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, my name is Juan, and I'm a night shift security guard. Over the years I've worked in several eerie locations, but nothing compares to my experience at the old, abandoned factory on the outskirts of a small town in Pennsylvania. What I thought would be a straightforward job quickly turned into a nightmare that I can never forget. The factory was an enormous, decaying structure that had been shut down decades ago. The building had been left to deteriorate, its steel walls rusting and its windows shattered. Nature had begun to reclaim the area, with vines creeping up the sides of the building, and the once well-kept grounds now overgrown with wild grass and weeds. The factory's history was filled with stories of industrial accidents and unexplained disappearances of workers. From the moment I stepped onto the grounds, I felt a sense of unease. The factory loomed over me like a giant, its darkened windows seeming to watch my every move. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The main entrance was barricaded, but my duties were focused on patrolling the perimeter and the surrounding grounds, ensuring that no one tried to enter the property. On my first night as I made my rounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The night was unusually still, and the factory cast long, eerie shadows across the grounds. As I walked along the rusted chain-link fence that surrounded the property, I began to hear faint noises, like the distant clanging of metal or a low, mechanical hum. I dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on me, but the sounds persisted. A few nights later, the noises grew louder and more distinct. It sounded like machinery coming to life deep within the factory, even though the place had been out of commission for decades. The rhythmic clanging and occasional screeching of metal echoed through the night, sending chills down my spine. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just the old structure settling, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. One night, while I was patrolling near the back of the factory, I noticed a flickering light coming from one of the upper windows. I knew for a fact that there was no power in the building, so I was puzzled. I shined my flashlight up at the window, but the light seemed to disappear as quickly as it had appeared. I decided to investigate further, despite the growing sense of dread that was gnawing at me. I made my way to the side entrance, which was slightly ajar, even though I was certain I had secured it earlier. As I pushed the door open, a gust of cold air rushed past me, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of rust and decay. I stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The interior was just as dilapidated as the exterior. Rusted machinery, broken windows, and piles of debris littered the floors. As I ventured deeper into the factory, the noises grew louder. The clanging of metal was now accompanied by a strange, rhythmic thumping, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor. I followed the sounds, my heart pounding in my chest, until I reached a large, open room filled with old, rusting machines. The air was thick with dust, and every step I took seemed to echo endlessly in the vast space. Suddenly, the thumping stopped. The silence was deafening, and for a moment, I thought I was alone. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I quickly turned, shining my flashlight in the direction of the movement, but there was nothing there. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It was coming from somewhere deeper within the factory. I followed the whisper, my flashlight trembling in my hand. It led me to a narrow hallway, lined with old offices and storage rooms. The further I went, the colder it became, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were unintelligible, a jumble of voices that seemed to surround me, coming from all directions. My skin crawled, and I had the overwhelming feeling that I was not alone. As I reached the end of the hallway, I noticed a door slightly ajar, with a faint light spilling out from the room beyond. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct telling me to turn back, but I couldn't ignore the pull of curiosity. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small and dimly lit, with only a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room was a large, rusted metal table, and on it lay an old, dusty briefcase. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I approached the table cautiously, my heart racing. I hesitated before opening the briefcase, but something compelled me to do it. Inside, I found a collection of old yellowed photographs and a small leather-bound notebook. The photos were disturbing, grainy images of factory workers, their faces twisted in expressions of pain and fear. Some of the photos showed what appeared to be strange, shadowy figures standing in the background, their features obscured. I picked up the notebook and began to flip through its pages. The handwriting was messy and erratic, filled with notes about strange occurrences at the factory, unexplained noises, missing workers, and sightings of shadowy figures that seemed to appear and disappear at will. The last entry was particularly chilling. It described how the writer had been hearing whispers, voices that seemed to be calling out to him, urging him to do things he didn't want to do. Suddenly, the light bulb flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I felt a cold, clammy hand brush against my shoulder, and I jumped, dropping the notebook. I fumbled for my flashlight, but when I finally managed to turn it on, the room was empty. The briefcase, the photographs, the notebook, they were all gone. It was as if they had never been there. I bolted out of the room and ran down the hallway, the whispers growing louder and more frantic with every step. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I burst through the side entrance and out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. The factory stood silent and dark behind me, but I could still hear the whispers in my head, echoing through the night. I didn't return to the factory after that night. I quit my job the next day and never looked back. But the memories of that place still haunt me, especially the whispers. They've stayed with me, growing louder and more insistent as time goes on. Sometimes in the dead of night, I can still hear them, calling out to me from the shadows. I later learned from a local historian that the factory had a dark history. During its operation in the early 1900s, it was the site of numerous accidents and fatalities. Workers had died under mysterious circumstances, crushed by malfunctioning machinery, falling from great heights, or simply disappearing without a trace. Some said the factory was cursed, that the land it was built on was once the site of an ancient burial ground. Others believed it was haunted by the spirits of the workers who had died there. One particularly disturbing story involved a worker named Samuel, who was responsible for maintaining the factory's boilers. According to the legend, Samuel had been a diligent and hardworking man, but one night, he vanished without a trace. His disappearance was never explained, but soon after, strange occurrences began to plague the factory. Machinery would start up on its own. Workers reported hearing whispers and footsteps when no one else was around. And several employees claimed to have seen a shadowy figure lurking in the corners of the factory. Some believed that Samuel had been driven mad by the factory's oppressive atmosphere and had taken his own life, his restless spirit now haunting the building. Others thought he had been the victim of foul play, his body hidden somewhere within the factory's labyrinthine interior. Whatever the truth was, it was clear that something malevolent lingered within the factory's walls. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself unable to escape the factory's influence. The whispers followed me wherever I went, growing louder and more insistent with each passing day. I started seeing shadowy figures out of the corner of my eye, dark shapes that seemed to move just beyond the edge of my vision. I knew they weren't real, but they felt so tangible, so close, that I couldn't help but feel a sense of impending doom. My sleep was plagued by nightmares of the factory. I would dream of walking through its dark, abandoned corridors, the walls closing in on me as the whispers grew louder and more frantic. In my dreams, I could never find my way out, and I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. One night, I had the most vivid and terrifying dream of all. I was back in the factory, standing in the middle of the large open room filled with rusting machines. The air was thick with dust, and the only sound was the distant clanging of metal. I tried to move, but my feet were rooted to the ground, as if the floor had turned to quicksand. Suddenly, the lights flickered on, revealing the room in stark, cold light. The machines, which had been dormant for decades, suddenly roared to life, their rusted gears grinding and clanking. The noise was deafening, and I clamped my hands over my ears in a futile attempt to block it out. As I stood there paralyzed with fear, I saw the shadowy figures begin to emerge from the darkness. They were tall, gaunt, and featureless, their forms shifting and flickering like smoke. They moved slowly toward me, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if they were marionettes being controlled by an unseen puppeteer. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figures surrounded me, their cold, clammy hands reaching out to touch me. I could feel their icy breath on my skin, and the whispers began again, louder and more insistent than ever before. In my dream, I knew that if they touched me, I would be lost forever, trapped in the factory with them for all eternity. I struggled to move, to escape, but my body wouldn't respond. The shadowy figures closed in, their hands just inches from my face, when suddenly, I woke up. I was drenched in sweat, my heart racing, but I was back in my own bed, safe and sound. The whispers had stopped, and the shadowy figures were gone, but the sense of dread remained. I knew that the factory had marked me, that its dark presence would never truly leave me. I've tried to move on with my life, to forget what happened at the factory, but it's impossible. The memories are too vivid, too real. Sometimes I can still hear the faint echoes of the factory's machinery in the distance, or catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure out of the corner of my eye. I've even considered going back to the factory, to face whatever it is that haunts me. But I know that would be a mistake. The factory, I followed the whisper, my flashlight trembling in my hand. It led me to a narrow hallway, lined with old offices and storage rooms. is a place of darkness and despair, a place where the past lingers and the dead refuse to rest. It's a place that should be forgotten, left to decay and crumble into nothingness. But I know that for me, it will never truly be forgotten. The factory is a part of me now, a part of my nightmares, and I can only hope that one day, I'll be able to escape its grasp. Sincerely, Juan. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, I want to share with you a harrowing experience from my time working as a night shift security guard at an old, disused warehouse on the outskirts of a quiet town in Maine. What was supposed to be a straightforward job quickly spiraled into a series of events so unsettling that they have left an indelible mark on my soul. The warehouse was a colossal, rectangular structure, long abandoned and surrounded by dense woods. Its exterior was a patchwork of weathered bricks and rotting wood, with windows long boarded up and the walls marred by time and neglect. The only accessible entrance was a large roll-up door at the back, leading into an immense, cavernous space that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. On my first night, I was immediately struck by the oppressive silence that blanketed the warehouse. The building was vast and empty, with only the occasional creak of the aging structure and the faint rustling of leaves outside breaking the stillness. The interior was a maze of shadowy aisles and towering storage racks, illuminated only by the dim beam of my flashlight. Dust motes danced lazily in the air, making every step feel like an intrusion into a forgotten realm. The first few nights were uneventful, with only the usual noises of an old building settling into its own decay. However, after the first week, things began to change. It started with faint clanging and thudding sounds from the far corners of the warehouse, noises that seemed out of place in the otherwise dead silence. I initially dismissed them as the building's natural movements or small animals finding their way inside, but the disturbances only grew more frequent and unsettling. One particularly cold and foggy night, while performing my routine patrol, I stumbled upon a series of unsettling signs. Handwritten notes, pinned to the walls with what looked like old, rusted nails, were scattered throughout the warehouse. The notes were cryptic and hastily scribbled, with ominous phrases like, "They're coming and don't trust the shadows." The hastiness of the writing and the desperate scrawl suggested that whoever had written these messages was in a state of panic. As the weeks went by, the disturbances became more pronounced. I began hearing footsteps that seemed to follow me through the darkened aisles. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, yet whenever I turned around, I found nothing. My flashlight would catch fleeting glimpses of movement in the corners of my vision, but each time I investigated, the area was empty. One night, while conducting my rounds, I discovered a heavy steel door that I had never noticed before. The door was locked with a combination lock, and had no labels or indications of what might lie beyond it. My curiosity was piqued, and I spent a considerable amount of time trying to figure out the combination, but it remained stubbornly shut. The sense of mystery surrounding the door only added to my growing unease. The disturbances reached new heights. I began to see shadowy figures darting across my field of vision. These figures were never fully visible, just fleeting glimpses of tall, slender shapes that seemed to melt into the darkness. They moved with an eerie fluidity, and their appearances became more frequent and unsettling. One particularly harrowing night, the power to the warehouse suddenly cut out. The entire building was plunged into darkness, with only the dim emergency lights casting long, ghostly shadows. I used my flashlight to navigate through the maze of storage racks and machinery, but the darkness seemed to swallow the light, amplifying the feeling of being completely isolated. As I stumbled through the pitch-black corridors, I felt an intense sensation of being watched. The silence was deafening, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the occasional distant creak of the building. Whispers seemed to come from all directions, faint and unintelligible, but carrying an unmistakable tone of menace. Every time I shone my flashlight in the direction of the whispers, I found nothing but empty darkness. Eventually, I stumbled upon a room that was completely different from the rest of the warehouse. It was smaller and contained an old-fashioned desk with a typewriter and a stack of yellowed papers. The room was untouched, as if someone had abandoned it decades ago. The typewriter was covered in dust, and the papers were filled with strange symbols and frantic scribbles. The atmosphere in the room was palpably different, as if it held a heavy, long-forgotten secret. As I examined the room, the temperature plummeted dramatically. I could see my breath misting in the frigid air, and an inexplicable chill ran down my spine. The whispers grew louder and more urgent, and I felt an unseen presence behind me. I spun around, but again, there was nothing. The shadows seemed to grow darker and more oppressive, and the feeling of being trapped deepened. My anxiety reached a fever pitch. The shadows around me appeared to writhe and shift, and the figures that had once been fleeting glimpses now seemed more substantial and menacing. The noises grew louder and more chaotic, with eerie creaks and groans echoing through the building. The cold drafts were biting, and the oppressive atmosphere made it feel as though the walls were closing in. The turning point came one night when I was reviewing the security footage from the previous weeks. The monitors displayed footage of the warehouse during my shifts, but something was terribly wrong. Shadowy figures moved through the warehouse with an unnatural fluidity, gliding through the space as if they were not bound by the physical constraints of the building. Their forms were indistinct, but their presence was undeniable. In one particularly disturbing segment, a shadowy figure appeared to be staring directly into the security camera. Its featureless face was an empty void, and its gaze seemed to hold a malevolent intent. I was horrified, unable to process what I was seeing. The footage made it clear that something was deeply wrong with the warehouse, something beyond the realm of ordinary explanation. Overwhelmed by fear and dread, I knew I couldn't continue working there. The constant sense of dread, the oppressive atmosphere, and the inexplicable phenomena were taking a severe toll on my mental health. I decided to quit the job, resigning from a place that had become a nightmarish prison. The experience left me profoundly shaken, and the memories of what I had witnessed and endured haunted me relentlessly. Even now, I sometimes wake up in the dead of night, convinced I hear the faint echoes of whispers from the warehouse, or catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure moving in the darkness. The warehouse has left a lasting mark on me, and no matter where I go, I cannot escape the feeling of being watched by something unseen and malevolent. The warehouse remains a place of fear and enigma, a location where the past lingers and the unknown thrives. I share this story as a cautionary tale, a reminder that some places are better left undisturbed, and that the shadows of the past can reach out to touch us in ways we cannot fully comprehend. Sincerely, Leo. And that wraps up our chilling journey into the world of night shift security guard horrors. Each story tonight delved into the eerie and unsettling experiences faced by those who keep watch over the darkness, revealing a terrifying glimpse into the unknown. From shadowy figures lurking in abandoned warehouses to inexplicable noises in the dead of night, these tales remind us of the thin veil between reality and the supernatural. Thank you for joining me on this spine-tingling adventure. If these stories left you as shaken as they did me, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on the next haunting tale. Until then, stay vigilant, and remember, sometimes the things that go bump in the night are more than just figments of our imagination. Stay safe and stay curious.